Well, that's it. I mean, we use the word authoritarian. Is that any different from somebody having authority? I mean, we tend to think of authoritarian as being that's the sort of authority you don't want, or something.
Yeah, top down.
Yes, right.
Control.
But can you get anything else from government? I mean, isn't it always top down control? In some sense, it's Ottawa trying to tell the rest of the Canadian peons what to do.
A small fringe minority holding unacceptable views.
His name is Wayne Baker.
My name is Wayne Baker. I recently had a wise person tell me, if there's an elephant in the room and you can't hide it, then don't. My elephant is scripting. I can't hide the fact that this whole thing is so new to me that I often find myself reading scripts in order to keep my thoughts straight and prevent excessive tongue-tying. I believe what we are doing is important, and as I become more comfortable with the media, the elephant will eventually disappear. Thank you for your patience. It seems hard to believe, but I'm introducing episode 5 to you today. As with any worthwhile enterprise, we've had more than our fair share of bumps so far, and we're just getting started. This week I'm talking with Dr. Grahame Booker about his PhD in political philosophy, which proves to be a refreshing change from political science. Dr. Booker is originally from Sydney, Australia. He has lived in Canada most of his life, and as mentioned earlier, holds a PhD in political philosophy. Retired from his profession as a high school teacher, he currently resides with his wife in Stratford. Our discussion includes, should government have any more authority than an individual? Dr. Booker's reaction to Winston Churchill's quote about democracy. Why a constitutional democracy is only as good as its constitution. What essential roles should the government execute? How and why politicians often follow the orders of bureaucrats rather than voters. Why Dr. Booker believes the COVID-19 pandemic was a hoax. The problems, dangers, and limitations of green energy as we currently utilize it. The difference between compulsion and compassion. How globalist elites are using altruism to inspire us into abject poverty. Dr. Booker explains why government is not the solution to the world's problems and how keeping it as small as possible is in the best interest of everyone but a small group of elitists. Please sit back and enjoy our 5th episode. Can you tell me a little bit about yourself, Greg?
Well, I had a long career. I made a living as a high school teacher a lot of the time, but also did graduate work on the side. At one point, I took time off to study at the University of Waterloo, where I eventually did an MA in philosophy, and then took more time off and went to Oxford on a scholarship for a year, but there wasn't too much happening at that time by way of employment for philosophers and that sort of thing. So I went back to my teaching job and stayed with it for quite a few more years, started a bit of part-time. I thought, well, since I'd started some work at Oxford, maybe I should try and keep it up. So I started a bit of work at Waterloo when I returned to Canada, and but it wasn't that well set up for part-time people, and so I abandoned that again, let it slide, went back to just kept on teaching. And then I did some work at University of Toronto for a few years, working again in philosophy of education, I suppose, at that point. And then I was supposed to be trying to do a doctorate there, and my supervisor left to go to the University of Calgary, and I used that as the excuse to let that slide again. And then when I finally retired from teaching in '98, I thought, well, I'd better get back and do something. So I went back to University of Waterloo, worked there for 10 years, finished my PhD, and did some teaching and the usual stuff. So, and then my supervisor had always been anxious after me to try and publish my thesis, and I finally got around to doing that a couple of years ago during COVID. So one thing that COVID allowed me to do was finally get my supervisor off my back and publish the book. So I did that.
Now, is that the book that you have?
Yeah, this is the book here, but I won't, and it's even coloured purple. So there you are. Look at that. And it's called Coercion, Authority and Democracy Towards an Apolitical Order. But I hesitate to wave it around because it's
bring it up.
It's a horrendous price. I wouldn't suggest anybody spend that sort of money on it. It's been listing last time I saw it on Amazon for $200 or something or other. I think it's available in the States in paperback, and I think I saw it in Europe in paperback a couple of years back. Not long after it had come out, actually. But the paperback is expensive too, so that's just the way it is. With Palgrave Macmillan, they're expensive publishers.
Okay.
Yeah.
Don't you think Grahame looks like a philosopher? He has the look. Like I thought, boy, this is like he looks like Socrates, doesn't he?
He has that Greek.
Yeah, the Greek
the
thinker look.
Mm-hmm.
The goatee and it's perfect. Well, the title here, Coercion, Authority, and Democracy.
Right.
So is that suggesting that democracy is an alternative to coercion and authority, or is
no? Basically, I think what I was arguing was I was trying to get clear on what the notion of coercion was in the first place. Was it automatically right or wrong, or could there be justified coercion? And moreover, is the state a coercive body? Because some people have said it isn't. You know, they said its primary task is not that, but I think that's the essence of the state, that it is coercive. And then the question is, well, where does it get its authority to be coercive from, or its authority to do anything from? And then finally, does democracy offer us some reason to believe it has that sort of authority? And if so, how does democracy do that? And I think I conclude that democracy doesn't do that in the end.
Doesn't do what?
Doesn't provide
the
rationale.
And
yeah, right.
So it's a progression. So the thing, if I can, the thinking is that we live in a state of coercion. That's how the state basically works.
Mm-hmm.
So why is the state coercive?
Right.
And where does it get its authority from?
Yes. How does it become coercive? Does it follow the moral law or something or other? Because we'd say that yes, there is some reason to coerce somebody trying to kill somebody else. Well, yes. Well, why shouldn't you?
Or steal from
prevent harm or
somebody.
stealing, or the basic moral principles that most of us would agree with. No force, fraud, or coercion.
Essentially, as a form of self-defense.
Yes. Right.
Or punishment.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Stopping people from doing bad things.
Right. Yeah.
A deterrent. Deterrent
mm-hmm.
from.
So where does the state get its authority from? Does it have any more authority than all of us do at the individual level? Is the question. And I say it doesn't. I mean, to the extent it has any authority, it has the authority you and I do to prevent harm to other people. When we can use coercion to prevent harm, and to the extent that the state has that, but it's often thought that the state's ability to prevent harm is of a totally different sort, just because it's on a huge scale or something or other, and that scale makes all the difference or something. But
the state has the authority to use force, whereas the individual does not.
Right. But why don't they? Is that a moral issue, or is it just a legal issue? Mostly it's because the state said that's what we're doing. We're in charge here, and you people do as you're told, and so on.
Which is not really in a balanced environment. It's something we can tolerate, but it's not a great situation. But when it goes out of balance and it becomes more authoritarian, then it becomes the more authoritarian, the less and less tolerable it becomes. Yeah.
Well, that's it. I mean, we use the word authoritarian. Is that any different from somebody having authority? I mean, we tend to think of authoritarian as being of that's the sort of authority you don't want, or something.
Yeah, top down.
Yes, right.
Control.
But can you get anything else from government? I mean, isn't it always top-down control? In some sense, it's Ottawa or trying to tell the rest of the Canadian peons what to do.
Well, the way the original, like we were originally set up, it's sort of the Ottawa had its area of influence.
Mm-hmm.
The provinces had their area of influence, and then the municipalities were
Right,
more top-down
right,
control from
right.
the province.
Mm-hmm.
But the provinces were like separate entities to the federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked reasonably well. There's no such thing as perfect.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to get your take on Winston Churchill's comment about democracy.
Right.
Let me see if I get it right.
Yeah.
Democracy is a terrible form of government, but it's the best we got.
Yes, or compared to all the others, or something like that. It's yes, that's commonly said about democracy. The question is, do we need all the others, or whatever? I mean, is that a reasonable comparison? This, most of them are dreadful. It's just this is the least dreadful. Do we even have to tolerate that much? It might be the question. You did respond to Churchill over. Do you?
Well, isn't there another one that would be better? It would just be the Republic, wouldn't it? Where you got minimum, like most of this stuff shouldn't even be on the table to be voted upon.
Mm-hmm.
There's two systems that I like, so far that I'm aware of. The American system, which is a democratic republic.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, what you're doing is you're electing managers to manage the Constitution and manage how the country is going to run under the umbrella of the Constitution. The other one is Switzerland. I don't totally understand Switzerland, but what I do understand is that the day-to-day management, they elect day-to-day managers. And if there's a major decision that needs to be made, increase taxes, go to war, anything really that affects the nation, it has to be taken before a referendum.
They vote on everything.
So it has to go before a referendum. What that does, I think, it makes it superior to ours in the sense that it forces the population to attend its government and to be aware of what the government's doing. Right now, people go along doing their thing, and then every 4 years we get into a big hype that we have to vote, and a lot of people they don't see how the vote affects their future.
If by representative democracy you mean a system which is based on the democratic principle of unlimited majority rule, but merely delegates that power to the chosen representatives rather than to the direct vote of the citizens. Is that what you mean? No, that would be even worse. Because for a large country, a majority would not be likely to agree on some vicious legislation, whereas a small chosen body of representatives, unguided and unlimited by any restricting principle, is the pattern of a tyranny. Then your representatives, in the name of the alleged majority, may be guilty of any form of violating individual rights, of establishing complete status tyranny, yet it would be consistent with your principle if the principle is unlimited majority rule.
Yeah, well, in some cases it doesn't affect their view. I mean, some people have argued that it's just not worth your while to walk out and vote because it makes so little difference that it's just not worth your while to even go to the polling station. So it depends, whether you think. I mean, in aggregate, it seems to make a difference. A big enough number of people vote a certain way, then you get an outcome of some sort or other, which is maybe one you can live with, or maybe you can't. Like we're stuck with at present, or something. But we're stuck living with it anyway because some sort of majority rule says that the present government deserves to be there or something by some mechanism or other.
And as long as that government's willing to live and respect the Constitution, then that government has a high level legitimacy.
Yes, that's the thinking. Yes.
Yeah.
The question is how good the Constitution was in the first place, and then what is it like to live with the Constitution? Lots of things that you can do, drive a truck through a whole lot of things, and I mean then you get modifications to the Constitution. I like the changes that the current Prime Minister's father brought in.
Well,
I mean, do we think they're legitimate? What makes them legitimate? Just because he brought them in, or something or other, or that they make sense on the face of it? Some of the provisions there, and
actually, I believe our Constitution is horribly flawed.
Mm-hmm. So there, I mean, so where are you then? If you've got a horribly flawed document, and you've got a lot of people now in the States, certainly those on the Democratic side who think the original one there was a horribly flawed document. They want to subvert it every way they can. So
they have over 200 years of history to counter that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what's going on in the Democratic side of the
right.
American
Mm-hmm.
Politics
Mm-hmm.
is a relative, like within less than 10 years,
Mm-hmm.
they've gone down this path.
Yes,
so
yes.
so there's 200 plus years of
Mm-hmm.
history
Mm-hmm.
versus 10 years of
Mm-hmm.
craziness.
Mm-hmm.
My name is democracy. My first memory was that of guarding ancient Athens against tyrants who might attack our freedoms. On my watch, a golden age dawned, lit by the brilliant minds of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. But while I watched for tyranny without, I lost sight of tyrants within. Citizens who abused me, manipulated me for evil ends. I turned from loyal to lethal, from vigilant to vicious. I bit friend and foe alike before sinking my teeth into Socrates himself. I fled in horror and shame. For centuries, I hid in a deep, dark cave. I hid to protect myself from my tormentors and to protect man from myself. Then, one day, some men found me. They soothed my fear, fed me, and cared for me. They wanted me to come with them to America to become a guardian again. When I confessed my dark secret, they produced an answer: the Constitution. This collar and the words inscribed would keep me trained on my true purpose and keep those who might manipulate me at bay. So I joined them. Together, we launched a new golden age with technological marvels that would have made Socrates glow with pride. The Constitution did shield me, at least as long as men like the founders of America held the leash. But naturally, they passed away with time, and I found myself in the care of new men. These men felt the Constitution was old, outdated, and that I should be given more power. Power to do whatever they thought was good. Roosevelt's New Deal, Johnson's Great Society, Bush's War on Terror, Obama's Obamacare. Demagogues pretended I could do no wrong, but I knew different, and so did one woman. Her name was Ayn Rand. She warned that without the Constitution, I'd become, and I quote her now, a social system in which one's work, one's property, one's mind, and one's life are at the mercy of any gang that may muster the vote of a majority at any moment for any purpose. And then it began to happen all over again. I felt the old madness return. My teeth grew longer. I began to growl and snarl, seeing enemies everywhere. I ran from one crisis to another, goaded by fear. In the frenzy of a global pandemic, my masters loosened my collar and let me trample basic rights to assembly, worship, and property. Even when my collar worked, my masters found ways to work around it, letting me snap at social media companies until they bent to political will. My citizens raged, And so I raged. They burned cities, beat protesters, and gathered in mobs threatening businesses, and even Supreme Court justices if they didn't bend to their will, the will of the mob. Rather than restraining me, my so-called defenders sought other ways to let me off my leash and expose me to corruption. They tried to eliminate voter ID, expanded mail-in balloting, even gerrymandered my districts to ensure their parties would remain forever in power. They shriek that I'm in danger. I'm on the brink. I'm under fire. All the while hiding my one true protection, the Constitution. I was bred to be a protector. Your protector. Now, I need you to protect me.
Anybody at all can walk across the border now, or at least the southern one. I haven't tried to cross the northern one.
They're a little stickier with
yeah,
the
that's what I thought.
Yeah.
He usually was that, and their response sometimes will be, "Oh, well, that's because there are lots of nasty people hiding in Canada, and we've got to watch for them." But the southern one appears to be wide open as long as you can swim the river or do something else and get into the country. Yeah.
Well, on the issue of the Switzerland example,
Yeah.
what, like, this whole idea of, like, do you think a lot of those things should even be allowed to be voted on? Like, that's the thing is, like,
Yes.
to talk, well, should we raise taxes or lower taxes?
Mm-hmm.
Should the government even have the authority to be imposing taxes?
Oh, well, yes, quite. Yes, and
It's
lots
like,
of
should this be voted on at all?
yes, right. That's the whole question with constitutions and everything else is what problems have to be solved for the whole and so on, or collectively in that sense. So what are the genuine collective problems? We probably won't get any agreement on those. You know, I mean, some people would say, well, national defence is one, but then others have said, well, yes, but you don't even need that because that can be solved by an insurance industry or some other sort of thing. There are other mechanisms for solving that sort of collective
How would you
action.
do that with insurance?
Some people have argued, Hans-Hermann Hoppe, for example, has argued at some length that it is possible to contract that out in the same way you contract out other services, and there might be a way of even doing that. You know, individual states having one defence contractor, and there's a lot of defence contracting goes on anyway. I mean, as we've seen, at least in the United States. Anyway.
The most powerful private security companies in the world assist governments with highly trained armed personnel and logistical support. Fear may be a strong motivator in uncertain times. Governments can only stretch so far, meaning some people are more than willing to pay private security companies to go the extra mile in protecting their loved ones. Firms operating in crisis zones around the world require protection as well, which has created a need for more vigilant and military-minded security service providers.
Anyway, that's just another way of saying that you don't have to have a government necessarily do it, and maybe you don't even have to have government hire contractors. It could be done at a much more local level or in a different arrangement. Anyway, that's a big discussion of itself.
Well, you would almost need a local, like a country the size of Canada trying to privatize the military, I think would be difficult, wouldn't it?
Oh, yes, maybe, yes.
Privatizing military for Perth County,
yes.
I think we can do it.
Well, the problem is how do you manage it? And look at, I mean, absent the military, we've got a myriad of different points of view. So,
yes.
how would you implement it, and how would you keep it out of the control of the psychopaths that want to blow things up?
Yes, well, and but then you've got the other problem of the psychopaths that get into the management end of it too, or the political end.
That's an issue. That's an issue in North America. Well, it's an issue. It's an issue with
right.
Yes. And I read once that the biggest problem we have that we've figured out how to live relatively comfortable lives. We have control over the elements in our living space.
Yes.
We have electricity. We've mastered electricity. We've mastered air, like air travel. We've mastered communication. Communication in a heartbeat.
Yes.
We've mastered our environment, but we've never mastered power. And power has hasn't changed for millennia.
Right.
I mean, we read the. I mean, if you want to go back into biblical times, we read how Israel was good and prospered, and then a king came in and was bad, and Israel fell down into the doldrums.
Yes.
And then we go into Roman times, same thing. And we go into medieval times, and it was actually psychopaths ruled the medieval times. And then we started. I mean, it started with the Magna Carta. That we started to change our direction, but we've never mastered power.
Right. No, and you know, sometimes we think, well, you know, we've come a long way since absolute rule in France of the 17th and 18th centuries, and so on. But have we? You know, what we have in some ways, in that it's not all done by pushing buttons in the Palace of Versailles or something, and in that sense. And but now we get people who push buttons in Ottawa or somewhere else, and Trudeau says, "No, I'm not a king." So, no. But what's the difference? I mean, you know.
But we really haven't changed. What we've changed is our means of production and our means of living.
Yes.
Because we've learned to capitalize on our resources.
Yes.
And created environments that make our lives easier. I mean, every one of us in this room live a higher quality life than the wealthiest kings in the medieval times.
Right.
Like our quality of life is just so.
Yes.
If our quality of life is as good as it is now, what was a peasant's life like under the in medieval times? It's hard.
Hate shopping? Become a medieval peasant and you won't have to worry about owning more than one set of clothes. Layering was common for the peasant class. Clothing worn next to the skin was made of linen, and heavier wool garments were worn on top of the undergarments. People understood that washing their clothing helped keep parasites away, and etiquette books advised changing one's underwear every day. For peasants, however, that often wasn't an option. If you were one of the lucky ones who could afford more than one set of clothing, you change into fresh garments once a week while washing your other clothing. Peasants who couldn't afford to send their garments to a professional laundress did their laundry themselves, washing their clothes in the river, typically with lye soap. Unfortunately, medieval rivers were often polluted with human waste, garbage, and runoff from animals' waste in the streets.
And the question is, I suppose, do we owe our quality of life to government or to something else? You're suggesting it more.
I say what?
It's to technology, to discovery, various things, and yes. So does government have any genuine role to play there, or is it just a parasitic role of just tweaking a few rules or coming up with some rules because somebody says there should be a law about that? So we have lawmakers who make laws, but do they really make a whole hell of a lot of difference?
Well, I think we bloom the best as a people or as a society when the government manages our environment so that we don't have to worry about someone murdering us, being having our property stolen from us, and we live in a relatively stable environment. I think that's the role of government, is to maintain a stable environment. It's not the role of government to borrow our resources, our grandchildren and great-grandchildren's resources to appease short-sighted, small-minded, selfish parasites.
What do you feel would be the? I know your book says apolitical, so it almost suggests that you kind of lean towards a total anarchistic view.
Yes. But basically, what I was doing it was more of an academic task in the sense of attacking one person who said that there were some notable fallacies that anarchists made, and I look at various ones that he said they made and say, well, they don't seem to amount to much. So really, the question is still wide open as far as I'm concerned as to whether you you could have an apolitical realm, and I think we could. I mean, we already said that much of the good that we now enjoy came apolitically. It came through technological developments, industrial progress, various things, which is not to say the government didn't have some role in on the side. I mean, for example, sometime I saw a program the other night talking about the way the railway gauge got standardised in Britain to 4 feet 8.5, was that there was a royal commission about it or something like that. So there were politicians got together and said, well, it might be a nice idea if we standardise it rather than have the wide gauge in one area and then so it got standard. So, but what do we need for that? Yeah, we need some sort of group to get together and say that a lot of coordination can be done at the local level or within an industry or something like that. They decide that it's in our interest because we can make more money doing that.
Like USB. I'm just saying universal serial. What does USB stand for? I know it's universal something, but you can take these cameras plugged into any computer.
Right.
Like that was not regulated by the government.
No.
Well, the idea of standardization came at the advent of the Industrial Revolution.
Yes, right.
Interesting story. Prior to the Civil War, the American government was looking for suppliers of guns and rifles, and at that point, each gun was made manually, one at a time. And actually, it was a chap that invented the cotton ginny. I forget his name now, but he conceptualized the standardization. And so what he did is he manufactured, say, 50 or 100 different guns in pieces. And then he took all those pieces and put like separate barrels, I would think, so that they didn't have to sort through the pieces. But they took all those pieces and put them before members of Congress and told them to make their own gun. And so all they had to do is just take the pieces, and that's how he demonstrated the value of standardization.
Right.
And then from there, like the rail gauge.
The development of edge rails and steam locomotives pressed another issue, that of railway gauge. Track gauge represents the spacing of the rails on a railway track and is measured between the interfaces of the load-bearing rails. Plateways are relatively forgiving of car axle widths, although gauge is still meaningful. Edge rails require a fairly precise fit of the flanged wheel to the track, and gauge becomes more important, as cars and locomotives built for one gauge will not fit on tracks for another gauge. Track gauge is an important factor. Wider gauges are more stable and generally allow heavier loads, but are more expensive, requiring heavier cars and locomotives and a larger right-of-way. Narrower gauges are less stable, but carry smaller cars and use a smaller right-of-way. In Great Britain, that led to a conflict in the first half of the 19th century between the 7-foot, or broad gauge, of the Great Western Railway and the 4-foot, 8 1/2 inch standard gauged used by the Liverpool and Manchester and London and Birmingham railways. The so-called gauge wars were an economic competition over control of lines, but the cost of transferring goods at the point where incompatible lines met, called the break of gauge, finally forced Parliament to act. The Regulating the Gauge of Railways Act of 1846 stipulated that new lines would be made on the standard gauge unless they were directly connected to the current broad gauge network. In many ways, the standard gauge is a reasonable compromise. In fact, research on ancient Roman roads suggests they used a very similar axle width on their wagons and chariots. While the demands of wagons and trains are somewhat different, they're both gauged on the size of human beings. A wagon with an axle width of 4'8" 8.5 inches comfortably fits 2 passengers side by side. A railway car built for a 4'8" 8.5 inch gauge comfortably fits 2 passengers on either side, separated by a central aisle. While railways in the United States started out using a number of different gauges, in general, railways in the North tended to use the standard gauge, whereas railways in the South developed on a 5-foot or broader rail that better fit cars that were built to carry cotton bales. At first, this wasn't a problem, as there was not a lot of rail commerce between the North and South, although the difference did play a role in delaying funding for the Transcontinental Railroad, as in 1860, representatives from the South were advocating for a more southerly route. The coming of the Civil War meant that the Southern representatives were no longer a concern, and Congress passed the Pacific Railroad Act in 1862 that not only guaranteed the central route for the Transcontinental Railroad, but stipulated that the entire route would be built on the standard gauge. But the difference in gauges did make it more difficult for the Union to move troops by rail in the South. After the war, during the period of Reconstruction, trade between the North and South grew substantially. The Southern Railroad system was largely repaired and expanded, but the gauge difference started to become more of an obstacle. At first, cars had to be laboriously unloaded and reloaded at the point of break of gauge. Then an ingenious device called the Ramsey car apparatus was used to change the trucks under a car without having to reload the cargo. Still, the process was expensive and took time. In 1884 and 1885, two lines that operated in both the North and South, the Illinois Central and the Mobile in Ohio, switched to a standard gauge. This allowed them to be more efficient and put pressure on other Southern railways to compete. In February of 1886, operating officers of the South's railroads met in Atlanta and agreed to change the Southern gauge. Curiously, they did not adopt the standard 4-foot 8 1/2 inch gauge, but the slightly broader 4-foot 9 inch gauge used by the Pennsylvania Railroad, with which many of the Southern lines connected. While trains from the two gauges were largely compatible, it was short-sighted of the committee not to move to the 4-foot 8 1/2 inch gauge, that as the track gauge of the Transcontinental Railroad was clearly the gauge of the future. Still, the commission went with the 4-foot 9 inch Pennsylvania gauge.
If they didn't standardize the rail gauge, they take the train to a town, and then
You have to switch over to a
you have
different
to
gauge
switch
and all that,
all
yes,
their
yes, yes.
the project, like the
Yes, the
whatever,
goods,
the
goods or
that's
people,
right.
as the case may be. Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Where standardized, they can just go
Mm-hmm.
one shot,
Mhm.
no
Mhm.
changeover.
Yes,
We see that with things like nuts and bolts.
yes,
That's all standardized.
yes. Yeah.
So-
I know a lot of that has, maybe the bulk of it has been achieved by industry because it was in industry's interest to do that sort of standardizing.
Society of Engineers,
Mhm.
and they sat down and they said, okay, what standards do we need?
Yes,
and,
yeah,
and then
right.
and then they
Some more efficient,
established the
more efficient use or more efficient production or something else. Yes,
Exactly,
Yes,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So we obviously don't need the government for that. Although sometimes there'll be government rules that they'll set up and say it has to be this way, or you can't do this, or you can't do that.
there's a certain amount of risk that the government takes on for innovation.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we put men on the moon
Mm-hmm.
because the government was willing to take the risk.
Right.
We'd never be able to do it otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Another story is the space shuttle.
Yes.
When they were developing the space shuttle, they had this this material
Mm-hmm.
that would absorb the heat
Mhm.
or prevent the shuttle from burning up on re-entry.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very delicate,
Yes.
and it couldn't be formed in a mold.
Mm-hmm.
They just got blocks,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what forced CNC manufacture, which is
Mhm.
computer numerically controlled manufacture.
Mm-hmm.
So that because they had to form these
Mhm.
airfoils
Yes.
and special curves.
Yes.
So now it's like that was just a 3-axis machine when we
Mhm,
machined it on.
mhm.
Now we've got 5-axis machines. And it's incredible what
Yes.
they can do.
And even in the case of space exploration, there's a lot of that's now done privately, or increasing amounts of privatization, and maybe initially because it was done under the defence wing or some other sort of thing, and then it was because government managed that, and they got into the big space. So and if you're going to spend lots of money, then it's an idea if you can dip into other people's pockets to do that. But if you're not quite sure how the whole thing's going to go, well,
to a point.
Yeah.
Space exploration is the worst. I should know. I'm the host of an outer space TV show on Fox called Exploration Outer Space, and I got my degree from MIT in aeronautics and astronautics. And what I've learned is that space exploration and technology are a waste of time and money, and everybody knows it. Why are we spending billions of dollars to send things into outer space when we have so many problems down here on the ground? Extreme drought along the West Coast, heat waves that are getting worse around the world, 3 billion people, nearly half of all humans on the planet, living in poverty. 62 million of those are little girls without access to an education, and Justin Bieber just can't seem to get his life together. So many problems to be focusing on. And at the same time, we have NASA over here spending $18 billion a year on space exploration and research. Now, Sure, that's only half a percentage of the total US federal budget, which is over $3 trillion. And okay, fine. With that budget, they conduct intense research, which leads to breakthrough discoveries and technologies that spill out across many diverse commercial sectors. But still, many people think space exploration is a waste of money. And I, for one, agree with them. And NASA's not the only one spending money on this worthless venture. We have billionaire entrepreneurs doing it too. Elon Musk, the billionaire genius behind PayPal and Tesla, is now dedicating both his brain and his bank to space exploration. And then Richard Branson, the man behind the Virgin Empire, now has his own space tourism company, Virgin Galactic, which is selling rides into outer space. And then the guy who created Amazon, Jeff Bezos, now has his own rocket company. All of these billionaire entrepreneurs and NASA are wasting their time and their money because space exploration is the worst.
Those are success, but the people that develop, especially the space and the things, the people that developed it went to work with a purpose. They went to work. Their supervisors were driven, and they expected their people to be driven.
Yes.
Now we've created a society of insecurity. We have supervisors that are in positions that they don't really understand why they're in those positions, and they have to make themselves look like they know what they're doing. And so they impose a lot of silly activities on their subordinates.
Yes.
And those silly activities are non-productive and actually quite destructive. And so
So you think particularly of the bureaucracy of government or something else?
Exactly.
Right, yeah. But the trouble is that that's the whole problem, really. That you say, well, the politicians set up policy. You know, they come up with the broad outline of what we think is a good thing to do. But then the trouble is that people have often said, well, that the devil is always in the details, and of course the detail people are the ones sitting in that block across from where the politicians are, and they're the ones who say where it should all go, or what they think the policy really is, or no, the politicians haven't got that right because that doesn't, from my background, that doesn't make sense or something or other. So they tweak it, move it in the direction they think it should go, and because in many cases because you have top bureaucrats advising politicians, then they often get in on the discussion at the very top level, the assistant deputy minister level or something or other.
There's a term for that. It's called the tail wagging the dog.
Right. So how do you get away from that?
I really believe that if we were in a constitutional democracy, that
provided you had a constitution that worked and made sense and all the rest of it.
But the elected representatives are the top dogs.
Right.
And they're the ones that are accountable to the public. And they're the one, and we really have an issue of accountability in this country. And the elected representatives defer the accountability to unelected bureaucrats.
Right.
And so they're saying, no, I can't do that because that's, and yet they're the ones where the buck stops. And they've relinquished their responsibility and abdicated their responsibility. And the bureaucrats, they like their position, they like their power, and they don't like being accountable for it.
Well, of course, yes.
So they're more
they're in it for the long haul, and they want to make sure that some guy who's only there for 3 or 4 years doesn't upset their apple cart.
That's exactly it.
But how do you ever get away from that?
That's the
no idea, because to get something done, you need the people who are doing it, who are going to do it. So they say that operationalize the policy, but it's in the operationalization. I mean, a classic example is the whole COVID mess.
Yeah.
How do we ever get into that?
You keep saying that you've got to get the green light from doctors, but where does the leadership of a politician come in, whether it's dealing with Dr. Williams or telling someone like Dr. Davila, who quite frankly I think would keep us locked down for months to come? At what point do you, as the person in charge, the elected official, say, you know what? I understand your position. I've heard your concerns, but there's other evidence, and there are needs out there that go beyond just dealing with COVID.
Sure. Could I go out there and be the only politician in the entire country, including the Prime Minister, all premiers, every single mayor, because I've talked to the vast majority of them, and say, okay, docs, I'm not a medical professional, but I'm going to disagree with you. When I said I'm going to follow their direction on health advice right from day one. And then if I did that, they could slap a Section 22 down, and it's just friction. You know, I'm going to stick with what I've done right from the beginning. I'm going to stick with health and science and work with them collaboratively. But I'm going to be very frank. There's no politician in this country who's going to disagree with their chief medical officer. They just aren't going to do it. They might as well throw a rope around their neck and jump off a bridge. They're done. I'm telling you the facts. It's very simple. I respect all the medical officers and all the docs that have been working their back off, and I will always listen to the chief medical officer, his team. Very, very simple. Because they're the professionals when it comes to healthcare. I'm not.
The public health officer made me do it.
Well, but what's really awful about the whole COVID thing is now that we're past it, I mean, after the Second World War, there was a serious reflection as to why it started, what happened, and what we can do to prevent it in the future. The COVID, okay, we know we understand why it started, we understand what happened, but we're not addressing how we can improve for the future. And that's
and that's even questionable as to whether we do understand what we understand about it. I mean, you have someone like Denis Rancourt at the University of Waterloo saying that there was no pandemic. The only issue has been because there's been the excess deaths that occurred once vaccination started, and they claim that there were no excess deaths. He's done all the investigation. He was a professor of physics and so on.
Yeah, I'm a scientist. I have spent decades learning science and math, statistics, everything from quantum mechanics all the way to environmental science, biogeochemistry. I'm interdisciplinary. I was a tenured full professor at the University of Ottawa, and I always spoke my mind, and that got me fired. This was before COVID, so I knew what it was like to fight the establishment. And when I heard the COVID propaganda, I knew immediately that it was intense propaganda and that it couldn't possibly be true because they were yelling that we were all going to die, and I couldn't see any dead bodies out in the street. And I did. I went out in the street and I looked around. I couldn't see any dead people, no matter what they said. And as a scientist, what I decided to do was to look at all-cause mortality data. So our nations collect very good data about the number of deaths. That's something you cannot be biased about. The person either died or they didn't. You know that they died, you know their age, you know where they died, and you collect that data. Countries collect very good data about deaths and births. So that is unbiased, hard data. We can analyze the number of deaths as a function of time, by age group, by sex, and by region, by jurisdiction, by province, state, down to municipalities and so on. And that is the data that I've been using since the very beginning of this so-called pandemic. And my research group, we were the first to say, back in an article that was published in June of 2020, that when we look at all-cause mortality data, there is no pandemic. There was a peak of deaths at the beginning in certain hotspots that was directly due to how people were treated in hospitals and care homes. It was quantitatively due to that. There is no, so I can tell you, after 3 years of intense study that we are continuing, I can tell you the following thing. And this is hard scientific conclusions from looking at the data. There was no pandemic. There was no particularly virulent pathogen whatsoever. There's no evidence for it. There is nothing that is spreading that causes death. The mortality doesn't cross borders. The virus has a passport. It refuses to cross borders. You can make a map of Europe. You can see countries where there's absolutely no excess all-cause mortality, right beside hotspots where there's intense all-cause mortality. So those are firm conclusions from I have written more than 30 scientific reports about all-cause mortality and COVID-related science, and I can tell you these things with certainty. So when Eva says there's no global warming, I also study global warming. I did the calculations, the radiation transfer. I can tell you Eva is right. As a scientist, I can tell you there's no global warming, there was no pandemic, nothing is spreading, nitrogen is not a problem, cow farts are not a problem. I can tell you these things with certainty. I'm not joking. I'm a scientist.
And there are many like him who claim that the COVID business was a fraud. It was a fraud pushed on us by just like the various other frauds such as global warming and so on. It was just pushed on us by the globalists because it was in their interest to get control and so on. And one way you get control is by telling people there's some deadly disease out there that you have to do all sorts of things for, and stay in your house and wear masks, and we know all the whole story we went through.
They say if you want a population to conform, introduce a pathogen.
Yes, right.
And you'll instantly get 70% conformity. So.
When you were comparing COVID to World War II, were you actually referring to the virus or the government's reaction?
What I was comparing is...
Or not the reaction, their actions. I think I should just say not reaction.
After the end of the Second World War, we had the Nuremberg trials.
Yes.
And Nuremberg trials was really a reflection on what happened, why it happened, and what we can do in the future to prevent it from happening again.
Yes.
And quite frankly, Nuremberg, if we respected Nuremberg through COVID, we wouldn't have had nearly the problems with COVID.
Right. Well, what you wouldn't have had is the ability to subject people to experimentation.
That's right.
Which is one of the medical experimentation of one sort or another.
Exactly.
That it would be entirely up to you instead of say a prime minister who gets on his feet and says, if you don't take a shot, you can't ride the bus. Well,
that's we're into the coercion.
Yes, right. Yes. And what justified that? Nothing whatever. I mean, and another one of the books I had was that I brought along was Fisman's Fraud, and Fisman was the head of the Ontario Science Table, and basically they put out a study saying that yes, there was some justification, there was good scientific justification for forcing people to take a vaccine, but then there wasn't any. And the more we learn about it, it was very dangerous to take, and you shouldn't be taking it unless you want to. But that was
Did you want to read a little of your preface?
Well, I could, yes. I could read a bit of that, and maybe that'll provoke a little more discussion. I'm probably going to head off pretty soon, but let's see. I'll read just a bit out of the preface, and maybe that's only a page and a bit, so that's not too long. As a classical liberal or libertarian, and so I'm sort of saying that they can go together in some way there, but some would say there's a very difference between the two. But
can you define those two terms just for
well, yes. I mean, classical liberal typically would say.
You said libertarian there, is it?
Yes,
do you
right.
consider them the same, classical liberal?
For the purpose of this discussion, I was saying they're close to one another, but others would say no. A libertarian says there's no justification of government at all. That we defend liberty, and we're not much worried about whether it leads to government or what. We want order and we don't want chaos, but we don't necessarily think that government is necessary to produce.
So is libertarian, in your view, is synonymous with anarchism?
Well, it could certainly allow for it. Yes.
Because Rand Paul's probably not Rand Paul. Ron Paul,
yes,
probably one of the most famous libertarians.
Yes, right.
He seems like he's just pro-minimalist government.
Yes, I think so. So he'd be more classical liberal, but that's all right. I mean,
so classical liberal is more minimal government.
Yes,
libertarians pretty much
can can become anarcho-capitalist if you like.
What is that term? Arco? Is that
anarcho-capitalist? Yes. saying that what we want is a free market and free individuals, and we'll create the order we need just because we need to in order to produce goods and do all that we want to do. Anyway, as a classical liberal or libertarian, I'm allowing that there could be a fair overlap between the two there. I'm concerned to advance liberty and minimise coercion. Indeed, in this view, liberty just is the absence of coercion or costs imposed on others. In order better to understand the notion of coercion, I discuss Robert Nozick's classic essay on the subject, as well as more recent contributions. I then address the question of whether the law is coercive, and respond to Edmondson and others who think that it isn't. Assuming that the law is in fact coercive, there is still a question, as with all coercive acts, of whether that coercion is justified. Edmondson thinks that this places a special burden on the state, on the state of justifying its existence, whereas it simply places the same burden on the state as anyone else. What I reject is the long-standing doctrine of reasons of state, namely that the state is not subject to the same moral rules as its subjects. With respect to the relation of morality to law, Edmondson thought that another of the fallacies of which the philosophical anarchists were guilty was that of assuming that there was a sphere of morality where the law had no business. On the contrary, our concern is with spheres of law which appear to have little to do with morality, which is to say, laws against wrongs of the malum prohibitum variety, as opposed to wrongs which are malum in se. So those Latin terms mean malum prohibitum means simply they've been prohibited by somebody or other, a government or as legislation, for example. Whereas we think there are some things that are really wrong in themselves, such as force, fraud, theft, standard moral prohibitions. So I don't know whether.
So what would like an example be like? What would be an example? Like a moral law, obviously, don't kill people.
Right. Yes.
And a government law that's not necessarily a moral law would be. Can you give an example?
A good example is moral law is don't steal.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, what's an example of a government law that's not a moral law? Yeah.
Well,
a moral law is don't steal.
Yes.
A government's law or government law is steal through taxation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, that's going on to the totally. Well, I guess that's the thing. As soon as it's not a moral law, it's going to be an immoral law, isn't it?
Yeah.
It might be, yes, or a law that has no moral basis or something, and I suspect the bulk of legislation might fit into that. That it's not to do with not stealing, not defrauding people, or killing them, and so on, and how much of the government's work is connected to that. And because often they will get round it and say, oh well, we have to have laws for the environment or something like that because if you pollute or do something else or don't drive an electric car, then you're killing people. So, when you continue to drive gasoline engines, then that kills a lot of people. But the question is, does it?
Well, yeah, that's the question. Is
Yes,
does it?
right,
And who does it? Who does it kill versus the electric car?
Yeah.
Look at the minerals that have to be extracted by virtually slave labor.
Yes.
So who's actually being killed and who's being harmed?
Just do yourself a favor. Don't think about the fact that production of an EV emits 70% more greenhouse gases than that of a gas-powered car, and it'll take nearly a decade of driving to offset those emissions.
Don't think.
And don't think about all the DIY lithium miners freelancing for the Taliban, who you're essentially financing by buying this car.
Don't think.
And definitely don't think about the staggeringly unregulated process of lithium-ion battery production, these South African miners getting neurological diseases from huffing manganese dust, the assembly facilities built suspiciously close to forced labor camps in China.
Can't think. Gotta drive.
Good.
Just because we have a North American-centric viewpoint, but we have figured out how to exploit a lot of different people in less wealthy nations. And how far do we want to go down that exploitative road?
And the problem is that government thinks it's in a position to pick winners. to tell us what direction the technology needs to go. You know, we need. I remember Trudeau said that we all need to be driving electric cars by when? I don't know. 2035 was it?
2030.
Yeah, or was it 2030? Was it?
We know we need to cut emissions. We know we need to reduce pollution. But one of the best ways of doing that is to get more clean cars on the road. As Laurie and David were telling me, their EV works great and is much cheaper to power than their gas car. Too often, though, electric vehicles aren't in reach. So we're making smart, targeted investments to change that. First of all, we're making EVs easier to buy. We're extending the program of up to $5,000 to help people buy electric vehicles. We're bringing in new mandatory sales targets of 20% by 2026, 60% by 2030, on the way to 100% by 2035.
How does he know?
Yeah.
Well, what gives him the authority to say that this is what we should do?
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, other than they've arbitrarily picked the number,
right,
and
said that this technology is better than what we're now doing, and it's the government's job to push us in that direction or something.
The reality is the technology we have for replaceable energy is so infantile that it's like our carbon tax is virtually really nothing more than a cruelty tax.
Oh right, no, it's just nonsense.
I mean,
just like his COVID rule that you don't get a shot, you can't ride a plane or a bus or take the train or something. No sense whatever. But he has the power, which you went back to initially. He has the power to get up on a platform and say that, well, what you should do or you shouldn't do. Yeah.
The reality is, and just to make my position fairly clear here, the reality is that there is more than enough energy that hits the Earth on a daily basis to completely support us if we could figure out how to harness that energy. There's more than enough to support us indefinitely on sustainable energy.
Yes.
The issue is that we really don't have the technology.
Right, and do you want the whole city covered with solar collectors? You know, that's the idea. The other problem. They talk in order to do that with the current technology, you would have to have pretty well the whole of Ontario covered with solar collectors.
The whole city is covered with roofs.
Yes. Yeah.
Why? And I know that there have been developments, and this is years ago, that incorporated shingles into solar collectors.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's more a function of now, I don't know what kind of resources are required to manufacture this.
Possible. And wind and solar only work when the wind blows and the sun shines, but we need energy all the time. The solution, we're told, is to use batteries. Again, physics and chemistry make this very hard to do. Consider the world's biggest battery factory, the one Tesla built in Nevada. It would take 500 years for that factory to make enough batteries to store just 1 day's worth of America's electricity needs. This helps explain why wind and solar currently still supply less than 3% of the world's energy, after 20 years and billions of dollars in subsidies. Putting aside the economics, if your motive is to protect the environment, you might want to rethink wind, solar, and batteries because, like all machines, they're built from non-renewable materials. Consider some sobering numbers. Building a single 100-megawatt wind farm can power 75,000 homes requires some 30,000 tons of iron ore and 50,000 tons of concrete, as well as 900 tons of non-recyclable plastics for the huge blades. To get the same power from solar, the amount of cement, steel, and glass needed is 150% greater. Then there's the other minerals needed, including elements known as rare earth metals. With current plans, the world will need an incredible 200 to 2,000% increase in mining for elements such as cobalt, lithium, and dysprosium, to name just a few. Where is all this stuff going to come from? Massive new mining operations, almost none of it in America, some imported from places hostile to America, in some places we all want to protect. Australia's Institute for Sustainable Futures cautions that a global gold rush for energy materials will take miners into remote wilderness areas that have maintained high biodiversity because they haven't yet been disturbed. And who's doing the mining? Well, let's just say that they're not all going to be union workers with union protections. Amnesty International paints a disturbing picture. The marketing of state-of-the-art technologies are a stark contrast to the children carrying bags of rocks. And then the mining itself requires massive amounts of conventional energy, as do the energy-intensive industrial processes needed to refine the materials and then build the wind, solar, battery hardware. Then there's the waste. Wind turbines, solar panels, and batteries have a relatively short life, about 20 years. Conventional energy machines like gas turbines last twice as long. With current plans, the International Renewable Energy Agency calculates that by 2050, the disposal of worn-out solar panels will constitute over double the tonnage of all of today's global plastic waste. Worn-out wind turbines and batteries will add millions of tons more waste. It'll be a whole new environmental challenge.
Shingles. But I think it's more a function of encouraging bright minds to come up with solutions to the problems. So I wanted to point out about liberty.
Yes.
It took me a lot to wrap my head around it, but the more I think about it, the more it makes sense. And I think this is the American way of viewing liberty.
Yes, a lot of people do think that, yes.
Is they view liberty not as important to them, but important to their neighbor. And really what they do is they fight to preserve their neighbor's liberty. And in a reciprocal environment, it makes a lot of sense.
Well, you could start with your own liberty, and then chances are you'll look after somebody else's too. You know, I mean, you're not obliged to do that, but you might well say to yourself, well, I don't want him to suffer because I could be the next guy or something. So you'll do whatever you need to do because you could be the next one, and charity and other things may come about that you would want to preserve their well-being as well. You know,
There's a difference between compulsion and compassion.
Yes, right.
When we're talking charity.
Yes.
Well, it would not be charity if it's compulsed.
Right.
Well, our system is being compulsive about charity.
Oh yeah.
And it's taking the opportunity for compassion away. Because if we're taxed to the point where the cost of housing, the cost of food, the cost of interest, the cost like the costs associated with living and the one cost that we have that is this is a real bugaboo of mine. A huge cost to living in this country. They don't even include in our cost of living index. That's our taxes.
Yes.
It's a huge cost,
right.
and it's not included. And that if we could change that one thing, it'll make a huge it'll make a difference in our.
And then of course you've got all the global stuff going on where they want to increase our costs, you know, because they want to make it unlivable. They want us living at the egalitarians want us to be sure that we're not living at the sort of high standard you talked about earlier, because that's unfair to people who are not living at that standard in some sense or other. So therefore what we do will bring us all down to the low level of being peons and.
What it's doing is it's creating a slavery. That's what we are. We're becoming. We're volunteering to become slaves. And
so what's the solution to that? It's government which is pushing us there. So.
I hope you enjoyed our rather heady conversation about the dangers of governments with too much power, which includes democratic governments. By incorporating our fundamental principles of freedom, which means liberty, responsibility, both individually and corporately, fairness, being in a system where we can reasonably expect fair and equal treatment regardless of our background or ideology, and respect of each other as beings created in the image of God. These four foundational principles of the People's Party of Canada will lead to a government that will function as originally intended, protect its inhabitants from external and immoral forces, either military or otherwise, and provide a stable and predictable environment in which its citizens can carry out their lives in liberty and freedom. With your support and effort, this will become a reality. Thank you for joining us this week.
Please share this episode of The Purple Microphone with friends and family. Remember, silence is consent. If you want to see positive change, you need to take positive action. If you have any questions or would like to help us, visit perthwellingtonppc.ca/contact for our email address and phone number. One of our representatives would be happy to meet with you to discuss your concerns. To become a subscriber to The Purple Microphone and Wayne Baker's uncensored email newsletter, go to perthwellingtonppc.ca/subscribe. Please consider making a contribution to help cover the costs of producing and promoting this podcast. Help save Perth-Wellington and the rest of our nation from government overreach, woke ideology, and irrational policies that are incompatible with freedom, fairness, respect, and personal responsibility. To donate, go to perthwellingtonppc.ca/donate. You can find all these links in the description below this video, along with links to any videos, articles, and books referenced in this episode.
Freedom is where there's neither tyranny nor anarchy, where the government works to keep people free. The PPC won't lock us down in a big nanny state. They'll leave us in peace to make this country great.
This production was approved by the Perth-Wellington People's Party of Canada Electoral District Association.